again, you are all very welcome, whether this is your first Language of Coaching book club with us this evening for me in Ireland, or this is your fourth, or whatever number you are on. Again, you are very welcome, and thank you for spending the next 60 to 90 minutes trying to upgrade the way you coach. And this being our fourth and final, it's important that we now get to the chapters that are meant to outline how, so to speak, the rubber meets the road. So we're going to be targeting chapters 6 and 7 for this session. Chapter 6 being going analog, so starting to talk about the use of analogies within your coaching. And then finally, what I'm really excited to talk about this evening, and that's the roadmap. For me, and I'll mention this again later, it was very important to have a chapter in the book dedicated to how you physically take this information and slowly but surely integrate it into your own practice. Having spent a very long time trying to develop myself in the way that I coach and communicate, I know how difficult it can be. And the number one source of feedback I get again and again when I run courses is something like, Nick, I get it, I love it, I even see it in my own practice. However, every time I go to try to generate external cues on the fly or go to generate analogies on the fly, sometimes I get tongue-tied and I just revert back to using those same old internal cues or those same limited external cues that I have in the past. And so for me, the roadmap chapter, which we'll discuss this evening, was born out of that need to actually put some flexible, so to speak, guide rails in front of you to show you exactly how I think you can successfully adapt and integrate and evolve your coaching to embody these principles. So that's what we have to look forward this evening. As we have with each one, just to look back from where we've come, obviously, we started with our very first session going through Learn This, chapter 1, and we unpacked basically the overall theme of the book, but specifically what is learning and why it needs to be the North Star of every coach and every teacher. From there, we shifted into a discussion in session 2 around attention and memory, which fundamentally, they're the building blocks. They're the core principles on which learning is based. And that doesn't matter if you're learning literature, you're learning how to write, or you're learning how to move. Attention and memory are our key principles. And then from there in our last session, we talked about finding focus and cue it up, chapters 4 and 5, where we started to unveil the principles of effective coaching through our DDCDD, our coaching loop. And then we dug into the actual cues we can use, zooming in from internal to external. And we talked about the role of those cues in teaching movement. And then finally, we started to get into the actual first model of the book, our 3D cueing model. We're going to pick that up this evening with going analog, which is the second major, so to speak, strategy model in the book. And that's how do we generate analogies? How do we generate ideas that put a visual in the mind, that simplify the learning process, that simplify these nuanced movement changes you are trying to encourage without taking the mind and overbearing it with too much information? How can we still keep the message simple, even though we're trying to make complex changes in movement? And then finally, we'll shift here into part 3 this evening and go through the roadmap and actually unveil some of the various cueing grids that bring these topics to life. As I like to say, allowing you to sample my language locker in the spirit of developing your own. And as it's been the red thread throughout all of these, it's our journey to a better how to coach, elevating it to the same level as what we coach. So to begin, going analog, right? How do we develop analogies? And just as a slight bit of review, we talked about this in our last session. This DDCDD model, the coaching communication loop, it outlines the key stops along the way, so to speak, as we are teaching and instructing movement. And we went through this in great detail. So I'd refer you back to YouTube and session 3 to go through that. But what I want to centrate on right now is as we start to talk about analogies and their use case, they're going right in, as we can see on the screen, into that cue it box. Not to say we can't use analogies in our descriptions and in our debriefs. Absolutely you can. But analogies for me are the super cute. They're the ones that over the years I have found increase the odds of learning more than any other type, even more than external cues in my own experience. And so my goal for this evening is to unpack that chapter to help you understand how to use analogies and leverage that superpower yourself. And again, highlighting just this comment on the bottom of the slide, to know versus to be. Remember, when it comes to coaching and coaching language, we're not simply trying to increase their knowledge of their movement. We're trying to increase their ability to be, to become the movement, to become this better version of the movement. And that's why we need language that can translate into better movement, not just better knowledge of the movement. And that's where we make this key distinction between descriptive language and actual coaching language. And analogies, very much so for me, are at the heart of effective coaching language. Now, when we open this chapter, I give you an option to read through some of the details around where analogies come from a language perspective, or skip ahead into the shallows, getting right into the practical application of analogy formation. For tonight, I want to start at the beginning, and I want to go through a little bit of the detail around why analogies are so important. And as I thought about writing the chapter, I'm like, how do I want to reveal, so to speak, the importance of analogy and how it is central to the way we think? That analogy, in some neuroscientists' opinion, is the basis of all human cognition. It's the basis of all thinking. And as I reflected on it, I felt who better than Jean Piaget. Now, if you haven't read Jean Piaget, but you've read chapter 6 in my book, a lot of those initial paragraphs, section 1, the primer, is based on his work, and specifically his book, The Psychology of the Child. And if you think about it, we come into this world without language. You can take a child and put them absolutely anywhere, and they will be able to learn the native tongue wherever they grow up. In fact, especially before 7 years old, we see children, this is very common in Europe, where within one given location, you could have access to 2 or 3 functional languages that are used in everyday speech, that young children can learn many languages. It's quite remarkable when you look at it. And so Jean Piaget, who is an absolute phenom from a developmental perspective, looking at children, had a lot of very interesting and profound things to say around how children learn in general, but most certainly how they come to understand and gain their native tongue, their language, their words. And so I want to walk you through a little bit of the stream of consciousness that I used in writing that first section of chapter 6, the primer. And so what we need to do is we need to go back to the beginning. And I want you to imagine a child, right? And even if you don't have kids yourself, I'm sure that you've seen an infant. And I want you to imagine that infant in your mind who is pre-verbal, right? They can babble, they can mumble, but they yet to have words. However, we know without any formalized teaching from mom and dad, despite their best efforts, they will absorb their surroundings and they will learn to speak. And we're not formally teaching them grammar, yet they will learn rules of grammar on their own. They will learn verbs and nouns and inevitably how to form sentences. And if we look at how that happens at a very 1,000-foot view, it starts to shed light on why analogies are so critical to our thinking and why they are so valuable from a coaching perspective. Because they tap into a natural way by which we take our outside world around us and bring it into our inside world of our mind and therefore create understanding. And so I use a very simple example in the book around a baby experiencing a banana for the first time. And so I want to walk through that example and maybe shed a little bit more light on what was going behind it. And so imagine now you have this pre-verbal baby. They cannot speak. And mom and dad put a banana in front of them for the first time. How does that baby experience that banana? Well, if we think about it, they can see it, they can touch it. If mom and dad put the banana in the baby's mouth, they can taste it. They can get the sense of the textures. They get the sense of the sweetness. And so baby knows the banana, not through their words and not through thinking in the conventional way that we think about it as an adult, but through their senses. They get a physical, literal representation of that banana. And as that baby gets older and that concept of the banana forms in their mind, they might actually want the banana, but they don't have the words for it yet. And so when baby sees the banana, they start to cry. And mom and dad are trying to figure out what's going on. And they're handing the bottle, then they're handing the toy, right? Then they're trying the apple that's cut up. And then, oh, finally they hand the banana. And the baby is soothed because the baby yet to have words for it, but knew that the sensory experience of a banana was what they wanted. And through effort, mom and dad will say banana, 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 and that association is formed. The child inevitably, once they start to learn words, they might say ba or nana, right, for short, but inevitably they'll be able to form the word banana. And they'll trade in their crying and their whining for the word, because ultimately they realize that in using the word, they get the outcome, get the banana to them far quicker. It's a much more efficient mechanism to share with the world around you what you want. It's one of the primary motivators of language. And so what happens there? Well, the initial experience of the banana was something literal in sight, in taste, in sound, in touch. And through time, that physical real life experience gets a label that we call banana. Think of it as the coat of paint that goes on that experience. It anchors us to that experience. So the word itself is not the experience. It's a symbol. It's a cue. It's a reminder. It's a label. It's what that word represents. That's what we, as a person, that's what we value. That's what we cherish. That's what we store. And so even though that's a very simple example of using a banana, it illustrates how language scaffolds. That as a young baby, we spend the first couple of years without language building up these experiences. In neuroscience, we call them representations. This literal thing in the outer world is represented through neural signals in our inner world. But inevitably, to communicate about that, to communicate about our thoughts of this outer world, we need a mechanism. Sometimes it's referred to as a psychotechnology. And this psychotechnology is language. And inevitably, if we go way back in time, language turned into literacy, alphabetical literacy. So we could take the words in our mind and in our mouth and put them on paper. And so if we track it all the way back, we find that language is anchored and represents literal, real experience. Okay, so what's the so what in this? The so what from a 1,000-foot view coaching perspective is simple. We literally need to pursue and try to achieve speaking our athletes' language. If we're using words and phrases for which possibly they've never heard, or at the very least, they've never connected a physical experience to, they literally will misunderstand us. They don't have the representations and the words for those representations to connect with what we are saying. And so often this is what is happening with poor communication. It's not necessarily that what I am saying as the communicator is wrong or inherently unclear, but rather the person in front of me doesn't have the experiences or the words for the experiences that I am using. And so ultimately what we start to see here is the value in understanding how our athletes communicate. The words, the phrases, the experiences, the ideas that are in their head that I collectively call their language locker is critical. because we can only communicate and understand from our language lockers as a starting point. This is also reinforces why visual demonstration oftentimes is such a powerful tool. Why? Simple. It goes back to the example we gave. It's like showing the baby the banana for the first time. If I give you a physical experience, one of your senses, not of the language required within cognition, but of your senses, visually, I experience it. Then as a coach, I can give that a word. I can give that a label. And that scaffolds understanding in the same way that baby labeled the banana, the experience of it, with the word for it. And so this really reinforces how language is embedded in physical experience and why we need to pursue and understand our athletes' language, especially as we'll talk about later as we get older, because there are most certainly generational differences in how we use words and phrases and even the pop culture that we reference in many of our examples as coaches with an analogy. Final point now. If an analogy, which we'll talk about again here in depth, if an analogy is a comparison between two things, something we are familiar with and something we are not, if we go right back down to the core, every single word is an analogy for the physical experience, the sensory motor experience it represents. Quite literally, this is why, as I said earlier, many neuroscientists believe that analogical thinking, this comparative associative thinking, is the core of our cognition. And language, as we've discussed, most certainly would fit into that model. So I don't know about you, I geek out on this because it reinforces that language isn't some throwaway thing. It is built into the physical experiences of our body. So if we use it effectively, we can tap into those physical experiences of the body, finding the light bulb moment so much quicker. I believe analogy is one of the best search tools, spotlights to do that. So I've already alluded to this, but let's now give analogy a definition. It's built into the core of our cognition. Its basis is in how we learn language. And at the very simple level, analogies are a comparison between two things, right? We use the words as an analogy for what they physically represent. They are associated. They share something in common. From a coaching perspective, the comparison uses a familiar thing to reveal something about an unfamiliar thing. And so we'll talk about this example later on. I use something the athlete is familiar with to teach them something that they are less familiar with. So if someone is struggling to gradually rise out of their sprint, this is why I will make the comparison to a jet taking off. If they have seen a jet taking off, they know that they don't just go flat, they gradually rise. And so if my athlete is struggling to understand that gradual rise, I could say, hey, you need to gradually rise. But that's a fairly abstract concept if you can't anchor it to something concrete. Analogies and the visuals they promote are concrete things from an imagination perspective. So I need you to gradually rise like a jet taking off. And it's those words like, or as if, or have you ever seen? Anytime you are using those phrases, usually an analogy is going to follow because you are identifying that this thing that the athlete is trying to learn, whether it's a concept or a movement or a concept to teach a movement that they're struggling with. And you, through that effort, through that comparison, are trying to sample something from their language locker that you believe they can connect with, that they have an experience with, and therefore they have words for. That's why analogies are so paramount to everything that we do. Now, let's just take these as very simple examples. And if you haven't read chapter 6 yet, I'm foreshadowing a little bit. Let's just see your analogical engine at work. I'm just going to read these out loud, and I just want you to reflect on them. What does a bottle rocket have in common with a vertical jump? What does a table have in common with a push-up? And what does a hammer have in common with a sprint? And so very early in the chapter, before I divulge a lot of the insights, I ask you these three questions. And if we think about it, okay, a vertical jump goes straight up explosively. Well, what does a bottle rocket do? It goes straight up explosively. So even though they are vastly different things, the human body to a bottle rocket, we can see that they share characteristics. And I would imagine even if you came up with different associations, you still were able to call upon associations quite quickly. Now, a table, static object, push up, it's something dynamic. However, how often do we reference a table when we talk about the back position in the push-up or other type movements? Even if we look at the bottom position of a single leg RDL, get flat like a table. And so we take this static feature of an object most people are familiar with, a table, and we map it. This is a key word. We map it onto this movement that they are performing. And of all the possible things they could think about, we give them one simple focus that's embedded in a visual experience they've had many times, seen and interacting with the table, and their body can map it on table to push-up. And the way I almost think about it is the table is on one Word document, so to speak, in the mind, and the push-up is on another Word document. And within these, we can say, okay, a push-up has this feature kind of like a table, and a table has this feature kind of like a push-up. And we start to make these associations, these links. We do it all the time. Now, the final one is probably the most difficult, but what does a hammer have in common with a sprint? Well, a hammer and a sprint don't share the commonality like a table and a push-up. A table and a push-up share kind of this commonality in a body position. But a hammer and a sprint share commonality in its use, what it is used for. And that when I sprint, I'm trying to hit the ground as hard as I can to project my body forward. Whereas with a hammer, I'm trying to hit an object as hard as I can to push it down. But either way, the connection is there is this force, equal and opposite, of two different objects, and something explosive is meant to happen. In the case of the hammer to the nail goes into the ground. In the case of the body to the ground, the body goes off the ground. But we can make that connection. Arguably, though, I want to put a little bit of a footnote on this. When we're working with young kids, we oftentimes use analogies. But where analogies fall down with young children is if they are too abstract, if they are not familiar enough to the athlete you're working with. So the hammer to the sprint is quite abstract. You need to have a pretty detailed, lived understanding of what a hammer does and what sprinting does. But if we were to ask a child, we were to show them a video of a push-up and say, how is that like a table? They probably could quickly come up that the shape of the back is like the shape of the table. And so oftentimes if analogies aren't hitting, it's not necessarily because there's something inherently bad about the analogy, but it goes right back to Jean Piaget. It's that they haven't built up the experience language coupling to understand what that analogy means. And so you're always going to be on safe ground if you're using analogies referencing things that you know the person in front of you has experience with. And we're going to get to that point again later on. So as we deepen our discussion in chapter 6, we move from Jean Piaget and analogies and where they kind of came from to, in my mind, a superpower in the analogical reasoning space. So Dietrich Gentner has done a lot of the initial work on analogy and how analogy is core to the way we think. In this paper, Structure Mapping, a Theoretical Framework for Analogy, little bit of heavy reading, but it's the basis for a lot of the work in the middle of the chapter. I've tried to simplify to make it very accessible. But for those of you that want to go deeper on this idea of structure mapping, how an analogy maps to this thing we're trying to teach, then I would encourage you to read that paper. And from her work, I created the basis of the model in the chapter. So we're going to spend some time now discussing this model of analogy that has a number of layers. And so the first layer I want to go through, and this is the order that it's revealed in the chapter, is that with analogies, we called them comparisons. Well, what are you comparing? What is it about the jet that is relatable to the sprint? Or what is it about the hammer that is relatable to the sprint? And how can oftentimes, as long as we're familiar with both things enough, how can we so quickly make those comparisons? What is our brain actually mapping from this, the jet, onto this, the sprint? And what Deidre Gentner's work showed is it falls into two categories. We are mapping actions and attributes. Okay, actions and attributes. Pretty simple words. What do they mean? Attributes, I like to think of as static characteristics. And from a movement perspective, these static characteristics are going to map on to what we call position, body positions. And so when we look at our analogy between the table and the push-up, we're saying an attribute of this table is it has a flat, firm surface. And an attribute of the push-up is we want the body to be a flat, firm surface. And so in looking at those two, an attribute is mapped from the table to the push-up. Okay, and I'm going to give more examples of that later on. What about action? Well, if attributes more relate to, in the vernacular of the book, body positions, or your ability to get into those body positions, actions relate to something dynamic. So power and pattern. And think notably of actions as the pattern. And so let's take the jet example. If we look at a jet taking off and we look at a sprint, well, a jet dynamically goes from low to high with a high level of force production, a high level of power. Well, dynamically, what action do I expect of the body in a sprint? I expect it to go from low to high with a high level of propulsion, of power. And so the action of a jet maps on beautifully to the actions of the body in a sprint. And so it was important to me to pay homage to the core terms from Deidre's work, but then compare them or map them by way of analogy onto the terms we've used in the book. So again, we see it here. Attributes relate to the body positions. So if I'm using an analogy that tries to capture a body position, I'm mapping an attribute. Actions relate to power and pattern. So something dynamic about the movement. So if we think back to the what does a hammer have in common to a sprint, referencing the action of the arms or the actions of the legs, something forcefully coming into contact with something else, that is mapping an action. Now, can an analogy map both attributes and actions? Most certainly. If we go back to the jet taking off, the actions are the low to high, that's motion, the propulsion, that's the power. But even if we look at what a jet is, from tip to tail, it's like head to heel in a sprint. It's a cylinder, it's firm, it's strong. Well, from head to heel, looking at the side, it's kind of cylindrical, and we want it to be firm and strong. And so some analogies have attributes, some have actions, and some have both. One is not better than the other. It just depends on what you are trying to portray. And so what I ask you then to do in the book is to go through the following activity. I give you a movement, in this case, the sprint, and then I give you 4 analogies to consider. And your job is to identify the best analogy in terms of its relatability to the movement, and then identify what are you relating? Are you relating something to position, power, or pattern? And so let's go through each of these, because I think the first thing you got to be able to do is make sure you're mapping the right stuff and then identify what that stuff is. So if we look at the first analogy, strike the ground as a sledgehammer would strike the concrete. So is that an appropriate analogy for sprinting? Well, if we look at it from an action perspective, does a sledgehammer create a very powerful, explosive contact with the ground? Most certainly it does. But where it deceives you is that contact with a sledgehammer is what? It's straight down, versus the contact in our acceleration is driving back. So if I use the sledgehammer analogy, I get the power piece, but I actually betray the pattern. And so based on how the athlete processes that analogy, it could actually encourage them to drive straight down. So the question then is, okay, is there an analogy that can give us that backward pattern as well as something explosive? Look at our next analogy. Strike the ground as an axe would strike a tree. When you strike a tree, bop, bop, you have to come horizontally, possibly even at an angle. And again, you have to do it very violently, like the sledgehammer. And so even though the sledgehammer had part of the story, the axe tells a more complete story. So we check the axe. The next question is, well, what are we actually mapping? Well, if we think about an axe, is it relating to the body position of sprinting? No, we're really talking about the characteristics of when the leg hits the ground, where the rubber meets the road. And so what it's portraying is a pattern of motion. So it's the angle of the axe, that's the pattern, but also how the axe moves. That's something very powerful, and it maps onto the power one would want to portray during a sprint. And so that starts to give us an indication of how do we get the analogy that's correct and what are we actually mapping over. The next two analogies we'll go through: burst out as if sprinting up concrete stairs, or burst out as if sprinting up a metal ladder. Again, we see the same thing. Both might be explosive, but a ladder is something vertical. Going upstairs is something of a more horizontal endeavor. And since people can quite literally sprint upstairs, you get a bonus point for that because you're actually making an analogy between sprinting and sprinting, but just in two different scenarios. This is on flat ground, but this is on stairs. But because you're drawing the analogy to the stairs, it starts to actually make some features of the movement more salient, or so to speak, turns features of the movement technique up. In the stair example, that might not be as vivid or visual in the flat ground example. And Nick, what do you mean? Well, very simply put, if you are sprinting upstairs, assuming you don't want to smack your mouth into those stairs, what do you have to do? You have to get your front leg up quite a bit, especially if you're trying to take them as 2 or 3 stairs at a time instead of 1. And so that might even be the analogy to further highlight that point. Hey, I want you to burst out of your stance like you're sprinting up a set of stairs, 2 stairs at a time. That by its very nature brings the mind to what would I have to do to get up 2 stairs or 3 stairs at a time. I have to drive that front leg forward in addition to pushing the back leg back. But the front leg is more salient because that's the one that is going to save me from hitting my face. So the beauty is you get the push, but that push is then complemented with more of an emphasis on front side, forward driving, knee driving mechanics. But here's the beauty. It is hidden inside of the analogy. I just explained that. And if you were to type out verbatim everything I just said, you would have hundreds of words. Yet the analogy gives me the emotion of it. It gives me the feel. It gives me the sense of it. It is, again, the difference to know versus to be. Have you ever had an intuition where you knew something? Even physically, you knew how to do something, but you could not explain it. And most certainly you are nodding on your side of the computer. How often has a great athlete been interviewed? Think of, Michael Jordan in one of his many first-time dunks or his amazing shots. Ken Griffey Jr. making, I don't know how many no-look catches up the wall, or whatever your favorite sports star example is. How did you do that? How long have you practiced that? I don't know. I just did. And so often we feel that we must be able to explain everything in language in detail, as if the mind processes movement one step at a time. But that's us putting our knowledge, our know-how, our cognitive thinking on top of movement, which is run under the radar. And so we can deliver that simple analogy. And I talk about this in detail in the chapter. And like the Matrix, the body can decode those key comparisons. And it's that sense you get, okay, yeah, I know what you're saying now. But if you were to ask the athlete, okay, well, why do you understand what I'm saying now? They'd still have to do a bit of thinking. Well, the stairs, I think you got to bring your leg up more. They might not even get that. But when they go to move, they will move as if they get it. And that goes back to this difference of knowing versus being. Analogies allow us to tap into the knowing brain using words and allowing the being side of our motor system to extract what it needs to bring it to life. And that's just, for me, that is the beauty of getting language right that maps onto that physical lived experience. So hopefully that makes sense. That's your actions and attributes and how they relate to the three things we want to portray, we want to share when it comes to teaching movement. It's either a better position, more power, or the right level of power, and most certainly the right pattern for the individual. The final piece then, everything we've been talking about so far relates to this idea of similarity, or the principle of similarity, whereby the analogy needs to have something similar to the movement you are teaching. It is the reason that the sledgehammer example is not a very good analogy for sprinting, because it is not similar enough to sprinting. An aspect of it is, but the directionality of a sledgehammer is not. Similarly, it would be like telling someone to sprint off the line like a helicopter taking off. Sure, a helicopter might be able to take off quickly, but it takes off vertically. But where do we want the person to go? We want them to sprint horizontally, which is why we use the jet example. And so it goes back to this core point. Our analogy needs to capture the right essence, the right feature of the technique, of the pattern, of the position we are trying to improve. But the second major principle that we end the chapter on is the principle of familiarity. And that is, as I've been talking about, as I opened this presentation with, they need to be familiar with the analogy. They need to be familiar with the language you are using. Are you speaking out of their language locker versus your own? And I take you on a tour of three major elements. I'm sure there are more, but I feel if you consider these three major elements, it's going to put you in the right position to sample their language locker and use language and experiences and examples that they connect with at a very deep level, which is important, as we know from our memory chapter, to memorability. And so those three features are their culture, their generation, and their personal experiences. As I talk about in the book, culture is more or less akin to where they grew up, right? So if I'm talking about working with someone in Ireland versus working with someone on the West Coast of the United States, I know culturally their phrases, their vernacular, the colloquial essence of where they grew up is very different. And I can speak to this personally, having gone from coaching in Phoenix, Arizona, to then coaching in Dublin, Ireland, where many of my analogies fell flat on their face. And it was only through that debrief, going back to our coaching communication loop, and sharing my thought process behind the analogy, that they were able to update me with an analogy that would be more culturally appropriate, one that would make sense to them. So culture most certainly impacts the analogies that will make sense to us and the phrasing of those analogies. And when we talk about culture, well, how do you get it? I'm not saying that you have to give people a questionnaire. It's just, are you listening for these pieces as they're talking, as you're asking questions, as you're just getting to know them? Are you listening for the raw material that could populate a future analogy that you use to teach them these movements that they value? The second major piece then is generation. So instead of where you grew up, when in the sphere of time, when did you grow up? You know, when I started coaching, the athletes that I would work with were more or less the same age as me. But now as I've gotten older, the athletes that I work with stay the same age as I get older. And what's happening? Well, my movie references and a lot of my pop culture references that I might use as analogies or a bit of humor to accent, right, memorability, they might not be landing. The music that is now in my gyms is not the same music that I was listening to when I started out coaching. And so again, are you listening for these generational differences so you can embrace them and leverage them in the language you use to coach these individuals? And then the final piece, which is robust and is independent of generation and culture, is just personal experiences. You know, if you're working with someone that played a number of different sports growing up, that is rich, fertile soil to grow analogies that they can use. because you can identify analogies from different sports or different activities they've had in their background and relate it to this sport or the movements that you are teaching. Equally, if people have hobbies, they're a weekend warrior, what are the things that they're into? As we'll talk about later on, physical analogies relating a movement in one context that is somehow similar to the movement in the context you're teaching, those are rich because the comparison is so obvious. And it's just the subtle difference in context, like the example of the stairs, that highlights that feature of movement that you feel could be improved without inundating them with the detailed steps to do it. And as a side note, this is so often why we're seeing analogy learning, as they call it, as a form of implicit learning. Learning without having to memorize the step-by-step details that sometimes we can deliver inadvertently through our excessive descriptive language. So further reasons why analogy learning is so valuable. It allows us to hijack, so to speak, that implicit learning system that is normal trial and error, but through actual language that draws people's attention to the most important feature without necessarily having to think about it. And so this concludes, so to speak, our chapter 6 on analogy, principle of similarity, and then principle of familiarity. If you use these two things, I promise you the analogies will start to reveal themselves. Start with step 1. What comparison am I trying to make? What feature of the movement am I trying to improve? And what is something this person is familiar with that is kind of like that feature? And then can I find an example to wrap around that they're familiar with? It's that simple. But you have to set your mind to doing this, because for many individuals, we don't just come up with the analogies off the top of our head. If we do, it's by chance. But as I say again and again in the book, we want to shift that to choice. So analogies in practice. Final piece here before we look at our roadmap. And so as I was writing the book, I knew I wanted to write a chapter on analogies. And I knew that I used analogies all the time. But I actually didn't categorize analogies till I physically went pen to paper. Again, this process of unpacking how you do what you do oftentimes reveals patterns. And for me, the patterns of analogies that I use consistently fell into these three categories of scenario-based analogies, constraint-based analogies, and object-based analogies, for which you have examples and opportunities to create your own examples throughout this chapter. And so scenario-based analogies are analogies that use the same movement, but in a different scenario or a different context. So explode off the line like you're sprinting up a hill, or explode off the line like you're sprinting up a set of stairs. It's a sprinting to sprinting comparison. The only difference is the context the sprinting takes place in. And it is something about that context that reveals a feature implicitly to the athlete that they need to emphasize or focus on, such as in both cases of a hill and running upstairs is more front side or forward leg action. A constraint-based analogy is an analogy where visually in the mind's eye, I'm still here on the track, in the gym, on the field, but I'm imagining there is some constraint around me, a cliff's edge, right? Or I'm balancing something on the top of my head. And so rather than in the mind's eye changing the physical world I'm in, as is the case with scenario, I'm simply bringing something into the world I'm currently operating in. So drive your knees forward as if to break a pane of glass. Says, imagine you're still here, but all of a sudden, pane of glass are in front of you, and you're blasting through each of those to reinforce the front side leg action. And for me, as an example, that's one of the best cues I've ever come up with to reinforce that forward drive. And if they don't like breaking glass, they can be hitting sparring mitts or other colorful language to reinforce that forward knee drive. But constraint is bringing something to them versus taking them in the mind's eye somewhere else. And then finally, object-based. It's an analogy that metamorphosizes, the body into another material object. So move as if you were a jet. drive off the ground as if you were a reactive bouncy ball, right? Load as if you were a spring. And so what we do is we take the physical properties of something else that they are familiar with, and we map them onto the body. As you explode in the air, get as straight as a pencil. Straight as a pencil is an object-based analogy that is mapping an attribute. A body position, get straight in the air. Get flat like a table, that's an object-based analogy that again is mapping an attribute, the body position that we want. And so I think what you'll find is as you start to look at the analogies you currently use, and most certainly use these three categories as inspiration with the model that we just went through, you'll find that analogies consistently fall into these categories. You take them somewhere else, you bring something to them, or you transform their body all together. And that gives us scenario, constraint, and object-based analogies. So let's just bring these visually to life. If you have the book, you know that we spent quite a bit of time trying to literally bring the language to life on the page. And why did we do that? Simple. I wanted to use the principles the book is on to physically write and create the book. And ultimately, if we're trying to use language that puts a visual in the mind's eye, I wanted you to be able to sample that. I wanted you to be able to see the coupling between the language and the visuals by making the visuals prominent and taking real life action shots and showing you how they map beautifully onto this visual imagery, which still pales in comparison to what the mind can do. And as an extension and as a footnote, reinforce that maybe even as a way to cue, we can start creating our own, as I like to call them, cue cards that connect these visuals with real life movement to help transform understanding, especially if the person you're working with doesn't have a huge visual arsenal from an imagery perspective. And most certainly people fall in a continuum. By physically showing them something, they don't have to generate it in their mind. So as a thought, using the book as a tool itself was a secondary reason we did this. So to review, scenario-based. Person is sprinting, but in this case, they're simply doing it up a hill versus on flat ground. The attributes we're trying to map are pattern-based of increased frontside mechanics. Constraint-based, again, one of my favorite analogies, absolutely effective, born out of the trenches, drive your knee forward as if to break a pane of glass. They're still sprinting live on the field, but in the mind's eye, we are bringing something to them. We are adding a constraint in the environment to shape how they move. Equally, if I had someone swerving, I could say, I need you to sprint straight ahead as if you are on a cliff's edge. And there are so many examples of this within the book. And then finally, probably my favorite, object-based, right? Accelerate off the line like a jet taking off. We want that natural low to high rise. That's the pattern. We want the explosive nature. That's the power. And tip to tail, that's head to heel. We want to map the physical body position. It's a triple threat when it comes to the relatability between the analogy and the movement we are trying to promote. Okay. Deep breath in and out. That is chapter 6 done. So now we are done with part 1 and part 2, and we are finally to the point where the rubber meets the road. At this point, if you've read this far in the book, you have all the raw material. Chapters 8, 9, and 10, as I say, 27 movement grids. That's my language locker. That's me demonstrating how I use the principles across the communication loop, specifically giving you external cues, cue tips from a cue tape perspective, and then the analogies. The chapter I now want to zoom in on as we go through some of those movement grids gives you the insights through my perspective on how you can slowly but surely integrate these practices into your current coaching practice, because we've all read the books and had all the great ideas and the great aspirations to change things. And then a month, 2 months later, 6 months down the road, what did I read again? Or what did he say about external cues? I did not want the language of coaching to fall short here. That's why this chapter is in the book. And so to begin with, before I go through the roadmap, I want to review a couple of our cueing grids. Again, there are 27 in the book, and I'm going to go through 2 right now. And so when we look at the cueing grids, they map on to our coaching communication loop. And so page 1, as you can see, goes through description and demonstration, where the bottom visuals are an analogy, a surrogate, so to speak, for the demonstration. And then I have provided example language one might use from a descriptive perspective. I wanted to give individuals an insight into how I would describe these movements. If we look at many books that portray movement, they usually have these descriptions. Where they sometimes fall short is making the cues we should use after the descriptions obvious. And this is where utilizing one of the most important models in the book to actually portray how we do this in real life was quite important. Now, at the beginning of every chapter, I reinforce that the descriptive language here is not meant to be a script. You're not meant to pull this out and read these verbatim, because at the end of the day, you're usually going to highlight certain features in your descriptions at certain time, but they're meant to be there as a reference point. And from a coaching perspective, they are the nod to the what from a biomechanical perspective of the movement features we're trying to promote. It's the cues that show up on the next 2 pages through the external cues and analogies. Those are the heartbeat from a teaching perspective. And so if we zoom in now, we have upper body pull, vertical pull-up. So I tried to use very, let's say, anatomical language that most certainly I would have adopted from my time at Exos with Verstegen and the team there. And for movements, you would have noticed that I tried to break it up into setup language when that was relevant and execution language. So how do I set up for this movement? And then what's the language around the dynamics of it? And so here, setup language, we have grip and the hang. And then from an execution perspective, we have posture, lift, and lower. And what you'll notice with all of our strength-based movements in the Cueing for Strength chapter, it goes always through those: posture, lift, and lower. If we fast forward then, we'll see that I use different phrases for the plyometric power section and different phrases for the movement skill section. What I tried to do here is say, okay, when we are cueing, categorically, what are we trying to cue? Well, we know that we're trying to cue positions. We're trying to cue it sometimes expression of power and the expression of patterns, how we bring those movements from A, extension, to B, flexion. And so rather than getting into a joint by joint, overly nuanced approach, which we don't need to get into, I think at times can be too detailed, I said, okay, let's zoom out and look at how I actually cue. Well, I'll cue the static positions, there's posture, and I'll cue the dynamic motion between those, lift and lower. And I explain the logic behind that in the book, but just to reinforce it. And so I'm not going to read off of these. You'll be able to see it on the video as well as the book, but that's the idea behind the execution language. It gives you the key anchor points of position and pattern, and at times power based on the verbs that we use. And that maps, if you would, to the 3 Ps that dynamically represent movement. And so if we shift over now to the second image, you'll always see these 2 rows. Row number 1 has the biomechanical lines, just to help the dynamic understanding of the motion taking place. And then the second row has the markers, which are meant to represent physical pieces of tape you can place on the body using the cue tape system that I talk about earlier in the book and bring to life in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And what I have then done for each of these phases and each of these positions, where relevant, I provide 4 external cues for our first row. So example, posture: get long, get tight, stay parallel to the wall, stay connected through the pull. These are all external cues for posture, and I provide similar for lifting and lowering. But when you drop down then to the cue tape, This for me is probably one of, I mean, the topic of the book is novel as is for many, but this is super novel within it. Now, I've referenced this early on, but I believe this is a method that will become normative from a teaching perspective. That when you are trying to make a very nuanced correction, you don't want to get into too much internal cueing, but you still want to make that very tight, let's say, single joint or very nuanced body position improvement. Well, we can use tape on the body as a way to circumvent any self-focused internal cueing. And so if we take posture, for example, I'll just read this one out. Place a piece of yellow tape on the upper back or chest, doesn't matter, and a piece of white tape on the lower back or above the waistband. Color does not matter. You can use the same color tape, reference top and bottom. It's just to make sure that you could understand and read these from a book perspective. And then from a cueing perspective, we can say, keep the tape stacked, or don't let the pieces of tape get closer as you pull. And what this does is it takes the entire body form in all the degrees of freedom that could call upon our attention at any one time, and it narrows them to 2 points in space. And it says, keep these 2 points connected. I would have given a similar example in an earlier session where I had someone sprinting. I put the tape on the exact same points, upper back and lower back. Asked them, hey, what does it look like when the tape gets closer? They extended. What does the tape look like when it gets farther away? They flexed. And because this person was always flexed coming out of their stance, I wanted to reinforce extension through the push to get them to neutral, that head to heel position we talked about. And using the 2 pieces of tape, I simply said, smash the pieces of tape together as you come off the line. And that instantly allowed them to get into the right position. It allowed them to solve the movement problem without a lot of step-by-step, chest up, back straight, full extension. Didn't have to go through all of that. It simply constrained the mind to those 2 points, allowing them to self-organize. And that's really what cueing is all about. It's taking the realm of everything that could distract us and bringing it into a central focus on the environment to get the right information, in this case, 2 points together, to change the movement in a productive, meaningful, memorable way. And so hopefully that makes sense. And there are plentiful examples as you go through the book through a diversity of movements. And then finally, to reinforce our topic this evening, we go from those external cues and cue tape examples to providing the physical analogies. Again, we would have liked to have provided multiple analogies for each of our sections of the movement, but we provide at least one for posture, in this case, lift, and then lower. And so posture here, imagine there's a wall in front of you. If you think back, what kind of analogy is that? In my physical environment, there's a wall in front of me. That's a constraint based. But you could equally make it scenario based by imagine you're hanging off a wall and you need to pull up it. Either way, it's reinforcing that spatial constraint that I can't move forward. From a lifting perspective, imagine you're on a cliff's edge. I want you to focus on pulling that cliff down. One, the cliff's edge is going to play into the emotional side, which analogies do because of their visual. They trigger certain emotional essence. So if I'm on a cliff, grip's going to be strong and I'm going to be quite motivated to get to the top. And then finally, from a lowering perspective, rather than just dropping down, if I imagine that I was holding on to a branch that was about to break, I'd want to be very careful as I lower to make sure I don't have that sudden impulse on the bottom. And again, it starts to capture these nuances and laces in emotionality within that analogy, which adds to the effort or the control in the case of the lowering analogy. And then finally, I'm not going to give the same long description here. We just, for our visual purposes, have an example from the jumping or the power section. So counter movement, horizontal jump. Again, we have setup language for the stance. Here we have posture, load, explode, and land. So we have 3 phases from a movement perspective, and posture being the dominant position within the entire movement. We have a certain postural position we want to see static from head to hip. Again, we have our execution language, and then we go through external cues, and then how you'd apply the cue tape system to this specific movement. And one final point on the cue tape system. You would not use the tape across multiple phases simultaneously. Rather, how does this work? Well, you identify, is it a posture issue? Is it a loading issue? Is it an exploding issue? Is it a landing issue? This goes the same for the analogies, the external cues, and the cue tape system. You identify the one major area you're looking to improve, and then you identify the coaching language strategy, for which I have applied 3 for every movement and movement phase I present in the book. From an analogy perspective, these are just some of my favorites. Again, from a posture, we talk about busting a band. Again, that's constraint-based. I'm still jumping in this present context, but I'm imagining that there's a band on my body that I have to overcome and snap. From a loading perspective, if we talk about the ski jump, well, that's a scenario-based analogy. I'm asking you now to take the same body position, but imagine you're in a very different scenario. From an exploding perspective, again, it's a scenario-based analogy. You're still having to do the jump, but this time you're trying to clear a body of water, and we've accented this with the alligators to bring in that emotional valence, to make that really punch forward, which is why I'm suggesting show this imagery to your athletes, especially if you're trying to work on similar movements. And of the 27, they are fairly generic. I think most people listening are going to use a number of these within their coaching practice. So don't feel like these are just for you. I absolutely designed them for you to show your athletes and be inspiration for ones you can create yourself. And then finally, landing, imagine you're in a puddle. Again, you could think of this as either constraint-based, a puddle's in your environment, or scenario-based. Imagine you're landing on the streets of New York, as we have depicted here. Okay, final section here, right? And then we're coming to the end, the cueing habit. At this point, there's no new information. It's all about how do you bring that information to life? How do you actually bring these concepts into your coaching practice? And I encourage you, of all the chapters, we want you to get through 1 to 6, but spend time in chapter 7. Chapter 7 is one you probably can revisit a number of times. I modeled it on the habit formation books that we know and love. The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, Atomic Habits by James Clear. I took these books and said, listen, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I want to take the unbelievable learnings that I've used from those books and map it to construct how we would build this cueing habit, this coaching habit, so to speak, because it is. Whether or not you know it, whether or not you think of it like this, cueing, communication, coaching is a skill. And in the same way that our athletes practice it and have you as a coach to support them in that practice, this is, so to speak, meant to be your coach. So I break it down into 3 different steps. After outlining kind of the habit formation process to prime your mind to absorb this information, we actually go rubber to road and say there are 3 different steps. Now, I give each step a certain amount of time. Step 1, week 1, believe me, you can shorten these timelines, you can extend these timelines. The key thing is that you go through these steps in a fairly linear process. You might need to revisit one from time and again to reinforce certain habits, but more or less, they provide you with a linear process to slowly integrate these concepts at a rate your coaching is comfortable with. And so step 1 is observe. You need to observe yourself coaching. And I provide 3 different strategies. You can either observe and simply reflect, you can observe and write, or you can observe and actually rate. And here I have a self-reflection sheet, very similar to the one I would use with my own coaches here with Irish Rugby. And here are the questions you simply reflect on at the end of each training session. And as I talk about, in the book, you can do 1 session. I'd encourage you probably to do a number of sessions. Some people might do this at the end of the day, whatever you feel comfortable with. As long as you are aware of what you are coaching, how you are coaching, and your athlete's experience of it, and you are processing that against a couple key filters related to coaching language, then I think you're moving in the right direction. So the questions I want you to consider: rating yourself from 1 to 10, I primarily used external language and analogies when cueing. Now you know that I've highlighted when cueing. It doesn't mean if you're giving a description with internal language, that's not what this is asking. It's specifically looking at that protected moment right before they move, what kind of language is populating that component. And you might even say, listen, gosh, my cues are hidden inside of my descriptions. I'm not even protecting that time for any specific cue, internal or external. Well, then rate yourself accordingly. Second, then, my external cues had a positive impact on movement performance. And you can think of that as external cues and analogies, meaning when you do give external cues and analogies, I want you to notice, are they having a positive impact? And equally, you could add another question. When I give internal cues, are they as effective? Especially if you try on set 1 an internal cue and on set 2 an external cue. You can play around, add questions. This is meant to simply be a starting point. 3, my analogies had a positive impact on movement performance. Again, rating yourself. 4, I provided one cue at a time, minimizing information overload. How good were you at that? And then finally, my athletes understood and connected with my cues. Are you ascertaining through their movement, through their body language, through their eye contact, are they in fact making these changes? And so using this as a starting point, you could give yourself a rating out of 50 and go from there to support your reflection. You could go all the way to the level that we go with my own coaches, videoing yourself to actually make sure that any kind of bias or mistruth from a memory perspective isn't being hidden in just your own reflection, but you have the video right in front of you. If you can make that happen and have the permission of the person or persons you are working with, fantastic. Step 2 then is, now that we've observed ourselves, non-judgmental, have not changed anything, now we need to start to act. The first action that I encourage you to take is the following, what I call the swap. So the swap, very simply put, is if you find yourself giving an internal cue, don't change it, let it play out, but assuming that they're going to have another set, try to swap it with an equivalent external cue. And so you might say things, okay, on the last rep, I asked you to think about squeezing your shoulder blades, right? To do that, I want you to now imagine that you're trying to break the bar like one of those old school strongmen. And so that's an application of a cue conversion that we can call the swap. The other strategy is to actually start to prepare your cues ahead of time. As I said in an Instagram post, we want to prepare our cues when we have time so we can learn to deploy them when we don't. Meaning the number one source of feedback I get is, Nick, I believe in these concepts. I see that when I use external cues and analogies, they work. However, when I run into an instance where I can't come up with an external cue or an analogy, I revert to type. I revert back to my normal communication style. No worries. It happened to me. It happens to everybody. So what I want you to think about doing is, if you can, come up with generic external cues and analogies across your movements. If you can, come up with specific ones for that person based on their area of need. Is it posture? Is it the lift? Is it the lower? Is it the load, explode, land? Using our cues connected to phases, patterns, and positions, right? And you can put those right in the program. As I've said, we need to create another column. We have a column for exercises, sets, and reps, and load, and even volume load. Where's the column for the cues? The other way about going about this is to actually create movement grids. That's what a lot of people are doing. Use the movement grids I have as inspiration, but start to create your own movement grids, whereby you take a movement, you break it up however you want. You could use my model of posture, load, and lift, or posture, explode, load, land, whatever it is. Doesn't matter. Use your specific biomechanical categorization. Ultimately, it's going to relate to positions and patterns. That's it. And start to list out your external cues and analogies. We have groups that I consult with going so far as they create these for their major movements. They laminate them, put them on a D-ring. You could extend it to start creating some visual analogies as I have in the book. But now you have a starter kit that as you are still learning to create this automatic habit yourself, you have a reference point. You create a physical resource for yourself. And so I outlined these varied examples you can use as step 2 in the act. And then finally now, step 3, become. Just like the athlete, you can't just know this. You have to become this. You need to learn to embrace your renewed coaching voice with these renewed strategies that have quite literally elevated how you coach to the same level as what you coach. And so I'd like to do just a light reading here from the last paragraph of this section. Be assured that you will make mistakes. You will feel uncomfortable, and you will at times sound silly. This is normal. For each time you embrace a mistake, you embrace vulnerability. And only through vulnerability do you alert your cueing habit that you are committed to change no matter what. I promise you that if you stay the course, your language will adapt. Here's the important piece. Your athletes will be better for it. Never forget, as much as this is about us as individuals, as coaches, as people, we are doing this in service of others. And that needs to be the fuel that we use to push ourselves, to stretch ourselves. In the same way, never forget that we ask our athletes to do on a daily basis. In final then, to bring this to a close before I share a few resources, you now have everything I have to give. And while there is undoubtedly more to say on the topic, I have said all I can. Thus, it is time for me to stop talking so you can start. And that is the sentiment I wish to share with you. I have put everything I can, literally, into this resource, have sacrificed many, many things, as many of you have. This is my initial contribution to this world, to our profession. And I hope now you can take it and you can make it incredibly loud and impactful in your own work and in others' work. As I have with all of our other sessions, I want to share a couple books. I've noted a few in the narrative this evening, but The Analogical Mind, it's a heavy read, but if you want to get to the bedrock of analogies, Deidre Gentner's work is beautifully presented in that book. Shortcut by John Pollock, that's a more accessible read on analogies, and a book for me that is absolutely brilliant, Louder Than Words by Benjamin Bergen. If you want to get to the core of how language and our bodies interact, that is the book for you. Again, if you've been with me for all four, for a number of them, or this is your first one this evening, thank you so much. Again, all the recordings are on YouTube. This is the fourth and final, will be up early next week. And again, I wish you the best of luck in applying these principles. For those of you that have been with me, all four, thank you so much for your commitment. And for those of you listening, again, if you haven't, if you believe in what we're trying to do here, I greatly appreciate you heading over to Amazon or wherever you purchase the book and reviewing it.